and to his staff for doing a lot of the preparatory work for this meeting. We are very pleased to have Encana as our co-sponsor. In a few minutes, I'll turn this over to Gerry Protti, who is the Vice President for Corporate Relations, but I want to extend a welcome to all of you. At the Canada Institute, we try to look at a lot of the key issues in the U.S.-Canada relationship. And the aim, of course, is to advance the dialogue between our countries by increasing public understanding and encouraging discussion across different sectors and working towards what we hope will be pragmatic solutions. Any list of key issues in our bilateral relationship would certainly include energy, and specifically the security of the natural gas supply. In commerce, in transport, in daily life, the supply and demand for natural gas binds the future of Americans and Canadians. What is needed is a candid and innovative exchange of ideas about how we can meet the ever-present demand for natural gas and how the use of natural gas resources fits into our broader energy strategies. Public understanding of these issues is not what it might be, nor is cooperation among different sectors. And that's why I'm glad to see that we have a very distinguished group here, not only among the panelists, but among the others attending as well, on both sides of the table. Woodrow Wilson believed that in order for public policy to succeed, scholars and business leaders and policymakers needed, in his words, to draw nearer together. You'll see that inscribed if you look carefully in the first floor as you come into the center. By learning from and working with one another, they could make more informed and thus better decisions. The Wilson Center and the Canada Institute are founded upon that premise. The future of U.S.-Canada relations and the quality of life of our citizens is tied to the future security of our natural gas supply. And forums like this give us the opportunity to work together in the best tradition of this great relationship between these two countries. It's now my pleasure to leave you into the hands of a highly qualified person to speak to you about these matters, Gerry Protti. Gerry worked in the energy industry for many years, previously serving as president of Pan-Canadian Energy, president of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, executive director of the Independent Petroleum Association of Canada. He's an economist by training. He's served as assistant deputy minister in Alberta's energy department. I hope you have a very productive session today. Gerry, we'll hand it over to you and wish you well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lee. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here to interact with you in this very important panel. As Lee mentioned, this is the third in a series of forums on cross-border relationships in the energy sector. And Canada was a sponsor of the first forum held in Calgary in March of last year. We're also pleased to be a sponsor of today's forum, which provides the opportunity for government, industry, and the academic community from both sides of the border to discuss and debate issues that impact our countries. Both of our countries have a critical interest in and reliance on a strong, functioning, and efficient North American energy markets. Before introducing the forum sponsors in our panel, I'd like to draw your attention to a recent report from the North American Energy Working Group, and it's entitled The North American Natural Gas Vision, and I think copies of this are available outside. I think this really highlights the importance of today's topic, and I'd surely encourage you to pick up a copy if you haven't already seen it. This particular report forecasts that natural gas demand in North America is expected to rise from currently about 76 billion cubic feet per day to about 94 billion cubic feet per day in 2012. Now that means North America will require an additional 18 BCF per day of natural gas supply in a very short period of time. In particular, more natural gas continues to be planned for incremental electric power generation in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and for crude oil and bitumen recovery from Canada's oil sands. The maturity of conventional natural gas supply areas and sources in the United States and Canada and the lack of capital to develop gas supplies in Mexico will mean meeting this North American demand growth is going to be a challenging proposition. That was one of the major conclusions of this report. This, at the same time, will create a significant opportunity for unconventional gas supplies and sources, such as gas from tight sands, gas from shale, natural gas from coal or coal bed methane, gas from Alaska, from Arctic Canada, including also gas from East Coast stranded natural gas supplies, and obviously gas imports via shipborne liquefied natural gas. The report also highlights the challenges currently facing the natural gas industry, including the need to remedy bottlenecks in production, transportation, and storage infrastructure, the need to overcome the significant siting and regulatory hurdles related to LNG facilities, the pipeline, environmental, and stakeholder issues related to the development of Arctic gas, the need for clarification on government policies on energy, on environment, and on land use, and the need to streamline the regulatory interface among the three North American countries. I think we all agree, and I'm sure the discussion today is really going to focus on this, that the greater interaction among governments and private sector will lead to a better understanding of energy policies and regulatory choices. And if we can get our common understanding together, it's going to result in more effective strategies to meet our future supply-demand needs at the most efficient prices in the market. As you all know, Canada is a proven partner in sustaining North American energy and economic security. Canada, as we all know, is the largest and most reliable source of energy to the United States. We have a strong and growing energy relationship, and we will continue to work together towards our common objectives of energy security and mutual economic prosperity. In terms of natural gas, Canada supplied about 88% of U.S. natural gas imports last year. In that role, Canada is the world's third largest natural gas producer after Russia and the United States, and the second largest gas exporter after Russia. Canada's performance as a stable, secure supplier of natural gas to the U.S. will only increase in the future as unconventional Atlantic Canada and frontier supplies are developed in the coming decades. I'd like to now take a moment to acknowledge the sponsors of this forum. The Canadian Centre for Energy Information is a nonprofit organization created in 2002 to meet what was determined at that time to be an urgent need, and it still is, for information about all parts of the Canadian energy sector. Developed for North American audiences, the Centre for Energy provides easy access to complete, comprehensive, and credible information on the Canadian energy sector through its print publications and web portal. Along with its commitment to excellence in its publications and portal content, the Centre for Energy continues to broaden opportunities for support and collaboration with other organizations, including governments at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels, and the Energy Council, which is an organization of legislators from both U.S. and Canadian jurisdictions. Our next sponsor for this morning's forum is the Government of Canada through the John Holmes Fund. The John Holmes Fund honors the memory of a Canadian diplomat and scholar by promoting public dialogue on Canada's international policy, supporting evidence-based analysis and research to inform international policy choices, and building capacity for independent advice on international policy. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the company that I represent, Encana Corporation. And for those of you that may not be familiar with us, we are one of North America's leading natural gas producers and the largest holder of gas and oil resource lands onshore in North America. And in fact, by the end of 2004, we were North America's largest producer of natural gas. Encana also has interest in and is a technical and we believe cost leader in the in situ recovery of oil sands bitumen. And we deliver our growth strategies from a very large portfolio of long life unconventional resource plays, both in Canada and in the United States. I'd also like to acknowledge Paul Connors and the Canadian Embassy for sponsoring our lunch this afternoon and for Paul's support and input on today's forum. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to thank all of you for making the commitment to join us today for this important dialogue. We're delighted to have congressional representation for this morning's forum. I'd like to acknowledge Dan Kish, Senior Advisor to the House Resources Committee. Where's Dan? Right. Hi, Dan. And I believe Alex Flint, Staff Director for the Senate Energy Committee, will be joining us later. Also pleased to acknowledge our distinguished representatives from the regulatory community, Pat Wood, Chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Jim Donaghy, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Energy Board, and Neil McCrank, Chairman of the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board. All three nicely located here. I might say on our right. For protection. We're also pleased to have both Canada's and the United States representatives on the World Energy Council with us this morning. Murray Stewart, Head of the Energy Council of Canada, and Barry Worthington, Head of the U.S. Energy Association. Is Barry here yet? Maybe not. I'd definitely be remiss as well if I did not acknowledge Minister Councillor Murray Smith as Alberta's longtime energy industry champion, the Alberta Minister of Energy until November of 2004, and now a new resident of Washington, D.C. as head of the Alberta office in the Canadian Embassy. And I think many of you that are here today will also no doubt be in attendance when Murray officially opens that office tomorrow afternoon. So welcome, Murray. I'd like to now introduce our panel, who will help frame this morning's discussion and debate on continental security of natural gas supply. I'll introduce them very briefly in the order they're speaking in. The bios of these well-known individuals are included in the package of materials you picked up at registration, so I won't repeat that material. Red Cavaney is the president of the American Petroleum Institute. I'll just mention that it's not in the bio that Red was recently awarded the Bryce Harlow Foundation Award. And this is an award for excellence in business-government relationships, and it's been going on for many, many years. And I believe, Red, that this is only the fourth individual from the private sector to win that award, so congratulations on that. Greg Stringham is the Vice President of Markets and Transportation with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. The next speaker will be Graham Flack, is the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Energy Policy for the Ministry of Natural Resources Canada. Skip Horvath is the President of the Natural Gas Supply Association. And Mike Cleland is the President of the Canadian Gas Association and Chair of the Energy Dialogue Group, an alliance created by energy industry associations to participate in a new dialogue on energy in Canada. And our final speaker, who's not here yet today, is James Slutz, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oil and Natural Gas, U.S. Department of Energy. I should also mention that this morning's panel presentation is being webcast through the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars website, as well as through the Canadian Centre for Energy Information's web portal. I'd like to welcome all of you who have joined us this morning via the internet. It's now my pleasure to turn the proceedings over to our esteemed panel. And so Red will be the initial speaker, and then we'll just roll through each of the individual speakers and then take a short break after that, and then we'll begin the open discussion involving all of you. Red, over to you.
Thank you, Gerry. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to participate in this energy forum. This is my second opportunity to do so. I participated last September and found the discussion both here in the forum and then the follow-on work that we did to be extremely helpful. So I much appreciate being here today. I think natural gas is an excellent example of the energy challenges faced by the U.S. And U.S. energy policy, for good or for ill, whichever way you want to look at it, really does affect all of greater North America. So discussions like this, I think, are very helpful to all parties concerned. As I was preparing for today's session, a story in the March 9th Oil Daily really caught my eye. It was in some quotes and some commentary directed at the Senior Director of Natural Gas Research for the Canadian Energy Research Institute. And in a new study, this particular quote jumped out at me. And I quote, "The U.S. paradoxically demands more cheap energy from the rest of the world, Canada foremost, while at the same time failing to capitalize on homegrown solutions to its problems, such as facilitating access to resources and construction of new plants." End of quote. I think you couldn't have said it better. Only a few short years ago, natural gas offered tremendous promise because of its plentiful supply and its environmental benefits. But what a huge difference a few years can make. Today, natural gas still has great promise, but realizing that promise has become increasingly difficult. In September 2001, our world changed really in more ways than just one. National security and energy security became synonymous. Energy security is all about ensuring you have the energy supply you need to satisfy consumer demand. Regrettably, U.S. energy policy decisions have increasingly moved somewhat in the opposite direction. Here in the U.S., we look to several major sources to meet our energy needs. In the lower 48 states, we have vast oil and gas resources, particularly in the Rocky Mountain West and offshore, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. We also look to the Alaskan Arctic for roughly a quarter of our crude oil production. But we import more than 60% of our crude oil and products. In addition, we rely, importantly, on Canada for natural gas imports, constituting 15% of our demand. The other 2% comes to us via LNG. All of these energy sources, both domestic and international, are vitally important. But current government policies are narrowing our options, restricting access to plentiful domestic resources that will be critical to the future. We in the U.S. are committed to fighting for increased access to these resources, and we're also committed to working closely with Canada to meet energy needs of our two countries. Neither of us can go it alone in the world of the future. We must rely on each other and work together to meet the common energy challenges that we both face. Natural gas, I think, is a textbook example of how the U.S. government's current approach to energy does not work. Last year, the Congressional Joint Economic Committee clearly stated the problem, and again, I'd like to quote, "Obviously, policies that simultaneously encourage demand and discourage supply cannot coexist indefinitely," end of quote. So the JEC also noted, and again I want to quote, "There is no disputing that known natural gas reserves, both within and outside the United States, are more than sufficient to satisfy any demand for decades to come." American consumers annually use about 23 TCF of natural gas, almost a quarter of all the energy used in our country. Natural gas demand remains promising. It powers the U.S. economy, cools and warms our homes, helps maintain our quality of life. Moreover, natural gas is vital to America's manufacturers, not only to power their operations, but it's an essential feedstock for the manufacture of many of the products demanded by our society today. The U.S. government has done a great deal to encourage the use of natural gas because obviously its clean burning qualities. Using more natural gas can help on a number of environmental concerns, including smog, acid rain, and greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, the federal government and some state governments have placed obstacles in the way of developing new natural gas supplies. U.S. natural gas resources are abundant, about 1,450 TCF, according to the National Petroleum Council. And that's enough natural gas to meet current U.S. demand for 60 years based on today's exploration and production technology. So according to the NPC, the Mountain West resource base is substantial, about 284 TCF, and constitutes 24% of the main resource base in the lower 48. However, some of our most attractive prospects for new gas discoveries are either explicitly off limits, as are most of our offshore areas, or severely restricted, that development is really not feasible, as is the case in much of the Mountain West. In the West, the NPC found that there is either no access to or such highly restricted and high-cost access that more than half of the region's resources are essentially off limits. Thus, we're denying ourselves the equivalent of almost a decade and a half of natural gas to power our industrial and agricultural needs. Obtaining permits to find and produce oil and gas is a slow and tedious process in the U.S. The numerous steps in this process provide ample opportunity for legal challenges designed to delay energy development. Anti-development groups have been quite candid about this. For example, the Wilderness Society said, and again I quote, "If you bid on a lease on public land, you can expect environmental litigation," end of quote. In a recent report on North American natural gas supply, the Canadian Energy Research Institute noted, and again I want to quote, "Vast areas of the Rockies are subject to overlapping rural, municipal, county, state, and numerous federal jurisdictions that may affect everything from endangered wildlife to visual harmony. The bureaucratic hoops that must be jumped through discourage E&P companies from even attempting to operate in such areas, despite their potential," end of quote. So both the NPC study and the recent American Gas Foundation study pointed to the importance of developing offshore resources. Thus, both studies called for lifting our moratoria here in the U.S. on OCS offshore leases. U.S. offshore areas currently supply more than 25% of our nation's natural gas and about 30% of our domestic oil production. However, most of this oil production and natural gas comes from the central and western Gulf of Mexico. So while Canada has opened its Atlantic offshore to development and is considering resources off British Columbia, the U.S. has chosen to close its east and west coasts as well as in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. By coincidence, just a couple of days ago in the debate over ANWR, one senator was able to extract a commitment to extend by 5 years continued moratoria off the eastern coast of Florida. So API's natural gas policy recommendations can be summarized in one simple phrase: expand our future supplies by implementing the policy recommendations of the National Petroleum Council's 2003 study. Key recommendations include increasing access to non-park, non-wilderness onshore lands and reducing the permitting costs and delays. More than half the technically recoverable resources in the Mountain West, as I mentioned earlier, are either off-limits or severely restricted. That's not an insignificant amount. For example, you can heat 60 million homes for 30 years on that supply alone. Second, lifting constraints on key offshore areas where high resource potential exists. Only 11% of the offshore lands under U.S. jurisdiction are available for leasing. 11%. Third, expanding access to world gas supplies. Expediting the approval process for expanding existing LNG terminals and constructing new facilities is essential. No one knows this better and does a better job than Pat, you, and the folks at FERC. If everyone else had the perspective you did, this problem would not be a problem. It would be an opportunity, a great opportunity, but we're not quite there yet. Developing infrastructure to deliver natural gas supplies to consumers is the final point I'd like to make. That involves being able to tap those huge Alaskan natural gas resources and bring them down to the lower 48 to serve the consumer base. So many of NPC's conclusions are paralleled in the North American Natural Gas Vision Report issued in January by the North American Energy Working Group, which was established by Canadian, Mexican, and U.S. governments to help increase the collaboration here on the North American continent. Among its key findings, the report said, and I'd like to quote again, bottlenecks in production, transportation, and storage infrastructure need to be remedied. More efficient regulation is needed to allow markets to freely function so that natural gas supply and infrastructure can be developed in a timely manner. End of quote. In looking at North America's energy needs, substantial Alaskan resources, both oil and natural gas, are particularly important. Access should also be provided to potentially vast resources beneath a small portion of ANWR in northeastern Alaska. That could, from the oil standpoint at least, it's projected provide as much as 20 years equivalent of imports we receive from Saudi Arabia. So moreover, the construction of the Alaska natural gas pipeline would allow existing stranded resources to be tapped and new resources to be developed. So overall, the NPC estimated that northern Alaska natural gas resources total about 213 TCF, enough gas to meet current demand for nearly 10 years. Increased import capacity for LNG is critical to meeting projected natural gas demand. LNG currently provides about 2% of the U.S. natural gas demand, a figure that could rise to as much as 17% in 2025, according to the National Petroleum Council. LNG can provide dependable and competitive supply link to some of the largest underutilized resources in the world. It can also serve as a bridge to await the development of Arctic gas in the north to be brought down to the lower 48, and therefore allow us to continue to maintain customers who might choose to go elsewhere because the interim gap is not sufficient to allow them to stay and take advantage of the Arctic gas when it finally reaches market. Local opposition in some areas has complicated rules stand in the way of trying to make all this happen. Improved federal and state policy coordination is needed to facilitate siting, construction, and licensing of LNG import terminals. As I said before, FERC, I think, understands this well, but too often, conflicting problems and a lack of understanding create delays, and delays create confusion, and opportunities are lost. Increased LNG supplies can help add to the total natural gas supplies, while Alaska, as I said, is trying to build its pipeline. It's absolutely needed. It is difficult to see how we can fill the gap. What happens to Western resources like coal-bed natural gas? Well, From the projections we have seen, we need all the gas we can have until Arctic gas reaches down here. So I think you can find that LNG and coal bed natural gas both can coexist very comfortably and help keep the demand on a track that will deliver the promise that natural gas holds for end users. In recent years, energy policy debate has begun to recognize that this is also a consumer and a jobs issue. People have come to understand that economic and jobs significance of some of these domestic decisions. The American Gas Foundation's recent study concluded that a continuation of existing policy to 2020 versus increased access to domestic resource imposes a cost of $200 billion on consumers in 2020. And the National Petroleum Council study indicated that increased access could save $300 billion in natural gas costs over the next 20 years. So in both countries, we must recognize that failure to address these energy problems has a direct and harmful impact on all energy users. Energy users, whether they be consumers, industrial users, or people who need it for feedstocks. They're the ones, these individuals, small businessmen and women, hospitals, schools, homeowners, that really are going to be able to realize the opportunities of natural gas if the supply is there. If it's not, they're going to bear the cost. So thus, it's more important than ever that we in the U.S. and Canada work together. We face the same challenges, the same needs, and the same opportunities. Working together, I believe there is little we cannot achieve if we just do a good job of explaining our story. We must recognize that others expect the U.S. to do its part, and the U.S. cannot expect others to help supply our energy if we are unwilling to expand our own domestic supplies. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Red. Greg Stringham.
Thank you, Gerry. Let me just hand around. I was told to keep this to one page, so I kept the font really small. No, actually, I put 4 charts on each side of the page, and it's a double-sided page, so that's it. I will keep my remarks very briefly. I am very pleased to be involved in this natural gas forum. I know that I did participate with Red in the last forum that we had and found that the discussion after the presentations was very, very useful. So I will keep my remarks very short, give you a very quick update, and we can move into the discussion to discuss some of the very important topics that have already been raised by Red. In doing so, I wanted to go back and kind of compare what I've been hearing in all of the reports that I've been getting from a number of the media sources and comments and calls out of Congress and Senate over the last little while. And I had to roll the clock back a long ways. So I went back to January the 2nd, 1897. Now, I'm sure that all of you remember exactly what happened on that day, but that was when the famous quote came out from Mark Twain, the author. And there's a quote that's been used over and over again, and it's been modified as it went forward. It's the rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated. So when it comes to Canadian natural gas, actually, let me tell you the story behind that story, and it will apply directly to Canadian natural gas. What happened was there was a reporter that came from the New York Journal, and he was sent out to find out whether Mark Twain was still alive and kicking. And he went and got there. The report that came to him said, if Mark Twain is alive and in poverty, send a story of 500 words. If Mark Twain has died, send a story of 1,000 words. And I feel like for Canadian natural gas it was, if Canadian natural gas is just flat and plateaued, don't bother filing a story. If it's dead and declining, write all you want. And so that's what I see has been coming out in a lot of the media, is that there has been a very strong rumor that Canadian natural gas is over. I think that I'm here today to try and dispel that rumor and give you a very quick update of what's happened recently. I'll leave it to Graham and Mike to talk about the longer term and as well about the policies that the Canadian government is doing to encourage that to go forward. I want to touch on just 3 very quick things. First off, what's been happening recently in Canada for natural gas supply. This is my dispel the rumor side. And talk about what's been happening beyond the conventional basin. We have many of our producers here in the room today that will be able to, in the discussion and questions, be able to describe what's happening in the new gas resources in Canada. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the oil sands demand. It has been said many times that I've heard repeated that the oil sands is just going to consume all of the Canadian gas anyway, so why do we even care about it? And so I will talk about that one directly. And then recently we've heard some positive things about cross-border cooperation, which has been very good, especially on the regulatory front. But also we've heard about some linkages, about, well, gee, we're not going to do this with our beef or that with this unless we do something else. And energy has come up in those discussions, so I'd like to lay that on the table for discussion. We have certainly been very aware of our Prime Minister, who every time that pops up is very positive in coming forward and saying, no, that is not the case. We are not linking our oil and gas industry to these other trade issues, but it does make it politically challenging. And I want to separate the politics from the policy, because the policy certainly is free trade and open borders. And finally, there's no way I can talk about the security of natural gas supply without briefly mentioning the great cooperation that we've had on the physical security. We have really been focusing with our regulators, with our governments, and between industries across the border to ensure that the physical security of the pipelines and the infrastructure is in place so that we can have the reliability of natural gas supply continue. So here's the quick update from Canada. Very briefly, this is a chart that shows the remaining reserves and the cumulative production from Canada, but it also shows what the ultimate potential is in all of the triangles that are out there. And thanks to our National Energy Board and our Energy and Utilities Board, of whom we have representatives here today, a report just came out earlier this month on the conventional natural gas ultimate potential in Canada. And this is the amount of gas that's in the ground that's expected to be able to be discovered over time. It actually went up again. The last report that they did was actually back in 1992, and there's been several others that have been putting reports out. But here it shows that it's up about 11%, and this is the ultimate potential that's going forward. So it is a very clear sign of yet there's more gas to be found. If I break it down just to the very short-term discussion, we did see a decline in natural gas production in Canada about 3 years ago. But since that point in time, there has been a continual progression of what's been going on and being produced out of the basin. As the January-February numbers for 2005 just came forward, we can see that they are up even over last year to the tune of 200 to 300 million cubic feet a day. Now, this is not the leaps and bounds of the growth that we saw in the 1990s by any means, but it is a sign that there is gradual incremental growth coming out of the conventional basin only. Likewise, some of the recent events that you may have followed have been two major discoveries in the Deep Basin in Western Canada. One that was brought on stream back in December, early December, and another one brought on in late December, or just starting to produce by the Shell Mankalte River. Both of these finds are quite significant in the size of the pool is not the smaller incremental pools that we have seen coming out of the basin, but very large pools that are in the very deep parts of the basin, in fact using new technologies that were able to open up the seismic data to something they have never been able to see before, and has really caused a great deal of stir in that part of the basin. And of course, I must talk, and Gerry mentioned a bit in his comments, about the natural gas from coal or the coal bed methane play in Canada. As I have said several times before, Canada's basin is about 10 years behind the one in the U.S., about 10 years behind the conventional basin in Texas and Oklahoma. But also on the coal bed methane side of things. As you all probably recall, in 1992, the massive drilling that started in the coal bed methane areas here in the United States, we are just hitting that in Canada now. So we're about 15 years behind. But as you can see there, we've barely touched the surface when it comes to the amount of drilling that's happened in this area. But yet the size of the resource in Canada is of comparable size, if not almost coincidentally identical to that in the United States. And so from that perspective, with perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 wells being drilled in the coal bed methane and natural gas from coal areas this year, this is really just starting to ramp up. And so a huge resource at the very beginning of its infancy. I just wanted to put this slide up. I know it's a natural gas forum, but we do talk about the oil sands. And the oil sands in Canada now have hit 1 million barrels a day production, and in the next decade will hit 2.6 million barrels a day. Significant growth going forward. But they too recognize that natural gas is a major input to the production of that oil. Still makes economic sense to do it. They use between a half and a full MCF of gas to create a barrel of oil. But they are now seeing the cost pressures, and the market is working to have these new technologies come in to replace or significantly reduce the amount of natural gas used to make oil. And so from that perspective, I presented 4 here. There's another 4 or 5 that are being tested. But these are actual processes that are being done at a commercial scale or being tested at a commercial scale now, not just bench experiments. And I won't go through the details of them, but the in situ processes here, or the Nexioptin or crude process, which uses no natural gas, is one that is either gasifying the heavy end of the oil or using some form of burning of the very heavy oil instead of natural gas. The big advantage to this is, of course, the gas that would have gone into this market then is freed up to go throughout the market in North America. But not only that, some of these processes are actually going to be producing more CO2, which we will talk about in a climate change world is not the right thing to be trying to put into the atmosphere, if it can be captured and re-injected in the ground Whereas you may have heard that some of our areas have gas production limited because it's gas on top of bitumen and they don't want to strand the bitumen. If you can actually capture that CO2 from some of these processes, inject it into the ground, maintain the pressure, and produce the natural gas, you have a win-win-win. You capture the CO2, the gas that would have gone into the oil sands gets sent to the market, and the gas that is currently in the ground and can't get out because of the gas over bitumen issue gets released and gets sold to the market at the same time. So there are very smart people doing very smart things in the technology world out there to try and bring more natural gas as quickly as it can to market. And lastly, but not least, of course, I do want to talk about the physical security of the system. We have been working very closely with all levels of government in Canada post 9/11 to ensure not only that we are still able to react to something that happens, whether it's a man-made or a natural disaster, but that we can actually be involved in the prevention and the care of those facilities to ensure the reliability and security of them. We have worked closely with the Alberta government, with the Canadian government, and cross-border with the Energy ISAC here in the United States and with other agencies here in the United States under Homeland Security to make sure that that cross-border analysis of the critical infrastructure is in place, is well documented, and I think most importantly when it comes to prevention of these kinds of events, that there is very clear lines of communication, so that if there is an incident that happens, it gets communicated across the continent very quickly to those who need to know in order to be able to react if they need to in time. And I want to thank those agencies that have been very open. I know it's a struggle when it comes to maintaining intelligence-type communication information, but it has worked very well to reinforce the security of the system because we do know that it is an integrated grid. So with that, let me close my comments by going back to 1897 and repeat what Mark Twain said. When it comes to Canadian natural gas, the rumors of our death are greatly exaggerated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. Now turn it over to Graham Flack.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm pleased to say that I'm an expert in two of the three elements of the title of the forum. The first is Canada-US, the second is security, and the third is natural gas supply. For the last 4 years following the September 11th attacks, I headed the group in the Privy Council office in Canada that managed the Canada-US security relationship, the Smart Borders process that Tom Ridge and John Manley launched. So I've been heavily involved in that side of it. For the last year, I was involved in developing Canada's first integrated national security policy. But in terms of natural gas, I'm new to the job, 3 months, so I'm here as much to learn as I am to impart knowledge. But I'm glad to have a panel of distinguished experts on either side that can help me out on this. I will say that one of the approaches we took in the Smart Borders process was to really try to benchmark results. And what I hope to flavor into the presentation at the end in terms of understanding what the Canadian government is doing in this area and where I hope we're headed is not to move beyond simply rhetoric like smart regulations, to do what we did in the Smart Borders process, which is on a bilateral basis, develop clear benchmarks for success, report publicly on the degree to which we can achieve those outcomes that we desired, and hopefully work towards, in areas like security of natural gas supply, outcomes that are going to provide wins for consumers, for the industry we're regulating, and let me walk through that. So if I could start just quickly, a little bit on Canada's contribution to the North American security of natural gas supply, a little bit on ensuring the future adequacy of the supply and where we're going on that with a particular focus on what the federal government's role is going to be, and finally some conclusions to leave you with. Now the first point on adequacy of gas reserves, the Mark Twain quote, quite relevant. As you'll see, the death is greatly exaggerated. In terms of reserves we're looking at, we are not running out of natural gas in Canada, and the emerging sources you can see there are extremely significant. And as was indicated by Red, in areas like the East Coast, where there's been reluctance on the U.S. side to facilitate exploration, in Canada we're moving ahead, and the real limitation here are technological and ultimately market barriers to moving ahead. So on adequacy, I won't go into the detailed numbers there, which many of you know better than me, but there are significant reserves in Canada out into the future. Moving to the next slide. We are supplying or 60% of the production in Canada currently is being exported to the United States, so we're obviously well beyond a self-sufficiency situation. This is about 17% of U.S. natural gas consumption. Obviously, we are the key player in terms of natural gas inputs. But let's move to the next slide, which I think for me was one of the key points, which is unlike, in fact, very much like many of the manufacturing industries we were dealing with in the post 9/11 era, where you saw factories as far away as Georgia shut down within 2 days as a result of the just-in-time delivery system shutting down. Happily, this is an area where the border is not fundamentally a factor in terms of the movement of product. We have a fully integrated North American gas system. It is really a model for how we like to see Canada-U.S. relations in terms of trade go, a true North American price with North American integration in the market. So when we can find those supplies, whether they're North American based or in terms of liquid natural gas that I'll talk about, whether it's coming into Canada or the United States, we have a capacity to move the product where we need to move it. Now, courtesy of the NEB, we've got, this is what I found to be one of the most useful graphs in terms of understanding where we're going on this. And the good news is that the direction for Canada natural gas supplies projecting out to 2020 is up. That direction is going to come from an increasing diversity of sources. That diversity will include unconventional sources. It will include liquid natural gas, which I'll deal with. New plays coming in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in terms of their expansion. And a file I've been having to spend a lot of time on in terms of moving it forward, the Mackenzie natural gas potential, obviously very significant. So just to give you a sense, there is going to be an increasing diversification of the sources of natural gas coming from the Canadian side. But we do see significant new sources emerging. Coal bed methane, as was discussed, barely touched in terms of its potential. The Mackenzie Delta, also Alaska, we are very keen to see the Alaska pipeline move through, which is going to have a significant impact on prices for consumers in the near term, but also in terms of supply that it brings on board and the potential of opening up other basins along the route. But as I mentioned, East Coast offshore, liquefied natural gas, the possibility of compressed natural gas, particularly off Newfoundland, and then an area just to project out even further, methane hydrates. As many of you know, the total stores of methane hydrates globally are larger than the gas reserves from other forms. We have, in our geological survey at the Natural Resources Department of Canada, really done some world-leading research in this. In terms of a gas hydrate field in the Mackenzie Delta, where we did extensive testing on that. It was the first fully integrated field study and production test of natural gas hydrate accumulation. We're beyond the bench side, but we're not yet into full commercialization side. But there's massive potential there in those areas that we need to look at. Moving to the next slide on ensuring future adequacy of supply. Well, clearly in the long term, the prospects for ensuring those supplies depend on our ability to develop the resources, and that includes the ability to get access to those resources in key areas. And we have been working on that, the East Coast being one of the examples. We need the infrastructure to connect, and that's one of the reasons we're so excited about the Mackenzie Delta possibilities, not just in terms of the near-term reserves it's going to bring on board, but in terms of what industry's telling us about the basin opening potential there for additional reserves that are going to come on stream as you have the infrastructure to be able to feed that natural gas south. In terms of ensuring, though, the adequacy of supply in the long term, clearly industry drives this, but government can get in the way of effectively driving this forward, and we're determined to provide a forum in which we can ensure that the right regulatory framework is in place to facilitate that. So let me move to the next slide and talk more concretely about 4 of those elements of that. The government's policy, which was a marked shift from before I joined the government, has been for many years now to endorse a market-based energy policy, that is the cornerstone of the government's policy and the basis that we think is ultimately going to best serve consumers and citizens in North America. But there are areas, and if I could move to the next slide, in terms of the market-oriented policy, we think that there has been real success here. In terms of the oil and gas sector, to pick an example, we have an investment of about $27 billion in 2003. That was more investment than in any other sector. We think the signals are working in the right direction, and we're getting the results we need based on that fundamental approach of a market-oriented policy. But to move to the next slide, there are longer-term initiatives where government needs to be able to play a role in fostering or indeed conducting research and development itself. We have, at our department, for example, work on coal bed methane that we're conducting in terms of tight gas, shale gas. I mentioned gas hydrates. Work in the offshore, obviously a very difficult drilling environment in many cases. So the government can play a role in fostering either R&D coming from companies or in doing direct research itself, as the government has done in some areas. Moving to the next slide. International cooperation in such an integrated industry is very important, and I really would like to salute the work of the NEB and FERC in terms of their cooperation, which I understand from the veterans of my department is really at a historic high in terms of the degree to which they are working together in a unified way to get the outcomes we're looking to get. It was mentioned by Gerry earlier, this really important work that the North American Energy Working Group is doing. A very interesting report they produced. If you'd said 5 years ago that we could have got agreement around a North American natural gas vision, I think many would have been skeptical about that. But I think very consistent with some of the positive outcomes of the cooperation that emerged following September 11th. We are seeing increased political attention to these issues, and I would, without lifting the curtain too much, invite you to stay tuned for the meeting that President Fox, President Bush, and Prime Minister Martin are going to be having in the coming week to take that next step forward in terms of North American cooperation, which will include an energy dimension to it. Finally, I'd like to talk about regulatory initiatives, and I think this is an area where government really needs to focus some attention. The Smart Regulation Initiative actually emerged in philosophy out of this Smart Borders approach we took with the United States, which was an approach that was about clearly articulating the objectives you wanted to achieve, publicly reporting on the outcomes, and benchmarking those results in a bilateral way. That's really the approach we want to take on smart regulations, that this is not just a government catchphrase that looks good in speech from the thrones and ministerial speeches, but to drill down, identify the areas where there are challenges, where we can do things better, and benchmark those outcomes in a way that's going to achieve the right environmental and economic outcomes, but to do it in a way that's more efficient. And we're not just at the talk stage. I was recently, as was Gerry, down at the Atlantic Energy Roundtable, where we've had some early harvest examples of this in terms of changes in the regulatory approach, changes that require, obviously, work with our environmental regulators as well, that we believe are going to achieve better outcomes in terms of faster decisions for industry, but to do so in a way that is respectful of the other objectives we need. So this is an area that I place extremely high priority on in terms of identifying those wins that we can potentially get that are going to move things forward. In terms of projects, though, and the Mackenzie Valley one is clearly one of the most important in terms of the work our department is doing now. We have put together a cooperation plan that is a cooperation both between the federal departments in terms of how they're going to deal with this, but I think really a quite extraordinary level of cooperation that the National Energy Board has been helping to pull together in terms of all the regulators involved in this process. There is of necessity in a project like this regulatory involvement from a whole range of actors. There is a regulatory cooperation plan that I think is the right way to do business in terms of pulling all of these elements together in a way that's going to provide greater certainty and more efficiency in moving the process through. So in terms of conclusions, the death of Canadian natural gas has been predicted falsely. We do have an abundance of resources that we can bring to market. To take one concrete example on the liquid natural gas side, interestingly, and I've asked a number of companies about this, we have not faced, with one exception, the NIMBY syndrome in Canada on liquid natural gas. Communities are actually welcoming the possibility of liquid natural gas facilities and the proposed sites coming in. So If you combine that with that integrated grid infrastructure we talked about, the potential for Canada being a gateway to liquid natural gas into the North American market is quite significant. We believe the market-oriented energy policy is the right way to go, and we believe it's paying dividends already. The part of that is witnessed by the massive investment we're seeing on the natural gas side in terms of new drilling. New sources are going to be critical. Some of that's going to require additional research and development, others closer to market realization. But among the ones I wanted to mention were coal bed methane, LNG, the Mackenzie Delta, Alaska. Methane hydrates a little further out, but we see that as a real potential and one in which research and development is going to play a key role, not just research and development conducted by energy companies, but also where government scientists can play an important role in helping move this science forward. And finally, on the regulatory side, which is, I think, an area we need to pay real attention to, ensuring that we get the regulatory outcomes that are the right regulatory outcomes, but that are reached in as an efficient as mechanism as possible. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Graham. Turn it over to Skip Horvath.
Thank you, Gerry, and I'm honored to be here as part of this distinguished forum. Thank you. We've noticed some alarming trends lately in Washington toward natural gas and attitude, and it's a tone change, and it's just been over the last 3 months, maybe 4 or 5 months, and that change it can be stated something like this. When I went to some receptions over the holidays, people would see me, meet me, find out who I'm from, and say, "Oh, natural gas. Well, you guys, that's a great fuel choice. It's terrific fuel. We can help you out. We understand you're having trouble making your market." Well, I represent fuel, pick a fuel, wind, it could be coal gasification, it could be nuclear. If you'll just support us in pick option A, some sort of subsidy on the Hill, or option B, some sort of change of the EPA so that the regulation would favor that fuel, we can help you out. We can make sure that natural gas can meet its demand. It's sort of a frightening change. It was brought home to me shortly after that. After the first of the year, I was walking down the halls of Congress, passed by a hearing room, and the door was ajar. And I caught a slide, and the top of the slide had LNG on it. And I said, "LNG? Gee, I didn't know there was something going on today with natural gas." So I lingered, and it wasn't natural gas. It was a solar presentation. The solar presentation, the presenter was making the point that if you'll just give us this subsidy, we will save you a tanker and a half of LNG going forward. And I loved it because it was a string of tankers, and the last 1.5 was X'd out. So we'd be saving the industry, the nation, the burden of that tanker and a half of natural gas coming in. And I happen to know the speaker, so I waited around for him afterward and says, "What was that about?" And he got very defensive. He says, "We're all doing it." He said the whole energy industry is using natural gas to say we can help those guys out. It sells very well on the Hill. And you have to ask yourself, now, how do we get into this situation? Now, I want you to hold that story in your mind. I'm going to come back to it at the end of my remarks. I'm going to turn now to the natural gas market itself in North America. Most energy experts in the world will tell you that the North American natural gas industry is the most robust natural gas industry in the world. Globally speaking, we have the best market. You've heard it today. Of course, we're talking about ourselves. But if you talk about to anybody over in Europe, we're the envy. We have thousands of buyers, thousands of sellers, competitive market, regulators who understand and appreciate the competitive market and encourage it. So it works. And arguably, we have the best natural gas North American market is the best energy robust market in the world. So did we get there by accident? You have to ask yourself, how did we get there? Because when I joined this industry in 1980, we were fighting with each other. I remember American producers telling the Canadian producers, stay out of our business. I remember the pipelines and producers fighting with each other. The list goes on that we're fighting with FERC. It was nothing but internecine warfare, and we all were bloody for it. And something happened sometime after take or pay, and during the process of trying to figure out how we're going to restructure ourselves, and the order that led to a 636 out of FERC, we realized that working together we could win-win. We found a way to make it work for ourselves, and that was not an accident. We had a culture change. We changed from being at war with each other to being a collaborative industry. It is now a culture in the natural gas industry. And I don't want to take this too far because I'll get in trouble, but just think of other industries in the North American market. There's one where the energy begins with an E, and that particular market has roughly now 2/3 of it is on a competitive model in the country, and a third of it is heavily regulated on the cost of service model. You wonder how long that can sustain itself. And in the natural gas market, we didn't satisfy ourselves with getting halfway there or 2/3 of the way there. We went all the way and restructured. So was it an accident? No, but I'm not sure exactly how we got to the collaborative model, but it's an important one to continue. I'll give you a couple examples of how, of course, it happened. NAFTA was key. It helped bridge that Canadian-U.S. Problem we had of not talking to each other, of trying to be very protective. But that was just a part of it. The industry itself, which is breaking into various sectors, pipeline producers, LDCs, also got together, formed the Natural Gas Council, again around that same time, in the early 90s, and started looking for win-wins. And that worked very well. I'll give you two quick examples. After the Enron debacle, the confidence of the industry and of the nation in the natural gas market, especially the price mechanism, just plummeted, dropped down to unfathomable levels, and it was hurting the market. We lost a lot of demand, and people were just ready to fix it by regulating it. There were all sorts of proposals. One was for FERC to become the price discovery mechanism. That'd be great, having the government be price discovery. Another one was no, FERC should just require it, put out a third party out there, and the industry would pay for it. That's a model that might work if the industry wants to do it. But we had another idea. We said, let's get together and figure out whether there's anything to this. So we got together and as an industry. And by the way, we included the Canadians in this, and they were very good partners in both of these examples. Canadians have been outstanding examples of how to be good participants. A lot of times long distance, but it worked. We got together and we looked at ourselves and we said, whoa, there are problems here. The way we work internally in companies, this isn't right. And we looked at the way the trade publications did the price discovery and said, whoa, room for improvement. So we made some recommendations to the Commission. The Commission accepted them in a policy statement. Policy statements are not force of law. They're more like guidance documents. And the industry voluntarily put those in place. The trade publications voluntarily put those in place. And when FERC did a survey just a few months after that, it found that on a scale of 1 to 10, the confidence was back up to a 7. Not perfect, but 7 out of 10 isn't bad. And I'm sure if we did one now, it would be higher than that. Second example was gas quality. In November of 2003, we started having, again, for the second time, liquid dropout problems in the natural gas industry. Our customers were complaining that they were getting butane, propane liquids falling out in their equipment in their part of the system. And there was no way to fix this except to issue OFOs, operational flow waters, simply cutting off the supply of gas. So we got together again as an industry and said, what can we do about this? And the first response was, it's easy. Let's just process all those liquids out. And the producer said, that may not be such a great idea because you're actually taking BTUs out of the system and you're already worried about the price of natural gas. So they said, well, let's talk about this more. So a year later, and it took us a year of dialogue, we formed two technical groups. They met constantly, and I mean nights and weekends, not for the whole year, but there were periods of nights and weekends meeting to come up with a set of recommendations that we've now presented to FERC, some technical recommendations. By the way, the Canadians were, again, very good participants in that. And we're moving forward with a technical conference, and we'll deal with that issue. So those are two good examples of how the collaborative process has played out and how we as an industry have used our culture of collaboration to make ourselves better off. But there's a danger. The danger I'm picking up now is complacency. Because while what those folks are saying is true, we are doing very, very well as an industry. We're making money. We're popular. That's pretty hard to do, both at the same time. And when you do that, what happens in industries, if you study industries at all, look at their associations, when industries aren't up, they tend to get complacent. They squeeze their associations. They stop worrying about Washington, always a mistake. And before you know it, they start plummeting. And that's always a danger now. Now let's go back to that story I mentioned in the beginning. Complacency will allow not just solar, but all the other folks who want to twist the rules by making the market less competitive to favor them. Whether that's, and tax subsidies are one thing that can be, we have tax subsidies too, so you can't complain about that. But the folks who want to change, for example, the rules of the EPA so that their fuel is favored, they will get their way if we don't continue to keep these dialogues going. So I urge everyone to continue this dialogue, and again, thank the sponsors for it, because this kind of dialogue is one of the ways we have of talking with each other. And let's use gas quality again to discuss how this might work out in a bad way for ourselves. We did a very good job, I think, if I do say so myself, as we were participants in that gas quality effort. However, we only included the Canadians. Only the Canadians. So what's wrong with that? It's a North American market. What's wrong with that is that the rules we put out, I don't know this for a fact yet, but I'm wondering if the rules we don't put out won't make the gas quality in the United States and Canada the most restrictive in the world. In other words, if we want to become part of a global gas market, do we not need to consider whether those gas quality rules are really effective globally? Or are we being the most restrictive in terms of gas quality? You can't come to our shores unless you are really pure methane. Is that what we're doing? We have to think about that kind of thing. We haven't thought about it together as an industry. So we have to broaden our collaborative culture to include others. I think that obviously the U.S.-Canadian Forum is a great example, but we may need to broaden that. And I urge you all to think that way as we go forward and look for the win-wins. And I think we can find them. Gerry, thank you.
Thank you very much, Skip. And turn it over now to Mike Cleland.
Thanks, Gerry. And again, let me join with the other speakers in saying thanks for inviting me to join you today. There's a presentation in your kits, and I'll ask you to dig it out. It looks like that. It's too many slides to go through on the screen, although I see we've got it up there, and I may get Greg to just go to a couple of them as we go along. But I'm just going to talk through it, and then maybe be able to refer to some of the slides afterwards. The Canadian Gas Association corresponds pretty much exactly to AGA, and we're the downstream end of things. And for that reason, what I want to do is take a look at this issue from that end of the pipe. Greg, flip a couple of slides forward. I mean, I guess the thesis here is that I think we need to be thinking harder about what we're doing to ensure public support for a lot of the things we're talking about. We talk to each other. We talk a lot to each other, and Skip suggests we do collaborate among each other. It's not obvious to me that we're talking enough to some of the other people whose support we need. I think we assume that the public will get it because it's so obvious. It's not perfectly obvious to me that the public necessarily does get it. So the next one, kind of just flip quickly what we know. Don't have to read this one. These are all things that we all know. And we take perfectly for granted about demand growth. Can I just get the next slide there, Greg? Growth of energy demand. We know it's growing. We know that we're making good progress on the reduction in the energy intensity of the economy, but there will be continuing demand growth because of the growth of the economy and population growth, not because of some moral shortcoming. That isn't necessarily widely shared. The next one. What's happened to energy supplies in North America? This is a Canadian perspective, but the U.S. is very similar. Basically, what that shows you is 100 years of an increasing trend to diversity in the energy system. What does that mean going forward? It means that new supplies are going to come on, whether it's wind or solar or various other kinds of sources, but it will almost certainly continue to include all of the existing fuels. And I believe that's a good thing, but also I think almost inevitable. So what does the public think? Not necessarily, if you go to the next one, what we do. Polls, you have to be a bit suspicious of them because they don't necessarily reveal what the public will actually do, but they do reveal something about what the public thinks, and they are certainly something that the political system takes very seriously in trying to figure out where the public might go. Let me just take you through a few quick ones. A poll that was recently done by a Canadian firm, Canada-U.S. comparisons here. Few things. What's the most important energy priority? Well, it's efficiency in renewables by a very, very large margin. My point here isn't that efficiency in renewables shouldn't be an important priority. My concern is the apparent balance in these kinds of results. We need to be thinking about getting public seeing more, a third on those. Next one, top priority for government. The protect environment and human health, and then everything else well down the list afterward. Again, it's a balance problem. All of those things are important, but it isn't perfectly obvious that the balance is right. But it's also a reality check problem. We know that the way consumers and voters actually act in the face of high prices or supply disruptions is not consistent with these kinds of results. Nonetheless, these sorts of results are influencing the attitudes of policymakers. Next one. And for those of us in Canada in the gas business, this is a particularly shocking one. We're right there with nuclear and, by the way, coal, who are one notch farther down. And then there's all the good things above that. The U.S. seems to have a somewhat different perspective on it. But again, I think Skip touched on some of these. Well, there's lots of other people out there prepared to step up and say, well, gee, you guys aren't there, but we are, and we can get you better environmental performance. So just snapshots. It's not systematic or scientific. It's one poll, but it's maybe indicative. And then the next one, again, it's a bit anecdotal. What we hear sometimes around Ottawa, I might also add Toronto, where I spend a fair bit of my time. Some very strange ideas. It's kind of a syllogism, sort of a perverse one, about what happens when you get the combined effect of environmental pressures, perceptions of running out of natural gas. What we're not getting is, boy, we better do something about getting more natural gas out of the ground. What we're getting is, well, if we're running out, then, okay, we'll do something else. Overstated a bit, but it's there. At least a straw on the wind in terms of public attitudes that we need to be thinking about. My point here, then, is that we do need not only policy support, next slide, Greg, but we can't take either the policy support or the necessary public support for granted. Next slide. We do get good, strong support. Graham talked about some of the things that he's been working on. But I wouldn't say that it is systematic policy support as we need. We get good project support. We get good support on some things, but I'm not sure that we're getting it at the level that we need. So my proposition here, question is, do we need to reposition natural gas? In Canada, certainly in Ottawa, the term sustainability dominates everything. I don't think that's a blip. I think that's something that we're going to be continuing to live with. We just go to the next slide. My point here is that I think we need to put the debate back in perspective. I think we need to recapture some of the high ground. We need to talk about sustainability. It isn't just about getting gas out of the ground and getting the consumers. It is about the long term, and it is about the role of natural gas in a sustainable future. What sustainability really means, and then putting gas in that picture. Next slide. For starters, a proposition as to what sustainability might indeed mean. A lot of us are familiar with the high-level sort of tripartite notion, which is fine, but not particularly operationally relevant. Some of us are familiar with the more current notion, which is almost wholly focused in some cases on climate change and greenhouse gases. I think we need to develop a more meaningful operational definition of what it means in its entirety, which includes environmental performance, but also includes a number of attributes. As it turns out, next slide, I would argue that natural gas is a unique confluence of the attributes of sustainability. And put it this way, I would say that we need to be out talking to people about how natural gas is a core element of any vision of energy sustainability over certainly many decades into the future, and that it has to be part of a centerpiece of our energy future. There's a series of other slides, and I'm going to just get Greg to flip through them very quickly. These are ones that I use in other presentations, and again, this is stuff that you're all familiar with. Environmental performance, we can make some a very good case on environmental performance, full cycle, up to and including the upstream. Next one, inherent efficiency. They have the right fuel in the right place. There are some good reasons to use natural gas because of its inherent efficiency in a number of applications. Next one, reliability. A continent-wide interconnected system with a very, very good track record for reliability. Very difficult to see an energy system with the reliability that we've come to take for granted without this sort of underpinning. Next one, adaptability. Looking forward, I think, again, in particular, because of its nature, natural gas has all sorts of attributes that allow us to adapt it to a variety of situations and be a complement, in fact, to traditional sources such as baseload coal-fired or nuclear generation, or new and renewable sources. It fits neatly in the middle of that picture. And then long-term security. There's several slides here, and we've talked about these, so I'll just flip through them quickly. 70 years of proven resources in North America. Next slide, access to very, very extensive world resources. And finally, Graham touched on hydrates. Again, if you look at that, you're talking about a couple of orders of magnitude of resource available as we deal with the engineering challenges looking forward. My conclusion, in a nutshell, I think we need to be working harder to make sure the public does understand what we're all about, what our industry does, and what our product means for them in the long term. We need governments to be very clear with their energy policies in support of that. We need to tie more effectively into the environmental debate as we look forward. And we need more systematic efforts building on documents such as the North American Energy Vision, the National Petroleum Council report. We produce these documents. The question next is, what are we going to do with them to use them to anchor some of our broader public advocacy? Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you very much, Mike. Now, I just want to check, Colleen, do we have any word on Mr. Slutz? And so we have, if he does join us, we'll obviously have him provide some comments in either before we take a short break or after the break. We have a few moments before we actually go to a coffee break, a few extra minutes. So I'd like to go back to the panel, perhaps give them the opportunity to make some additional comments given what they've heard. There's clearly some themes here that I think we can build on in the question period, but one area I'd be interested in the panel's comments is we've clearly heard that there's going to be a diversification of North American natural gas supply as these new sources develop. But we've also heard throughout the presentations that there needs to be quite a bit of work still to be done to get the policy framework, the regulatory framework operating at tip-top condition. It seems to be progressing quite well. We've had warnings not to be complacent. And then the final speaker, Mike Cleland, talked about the role of the public in this development as we go forward. And my question generally for the panel is, do we run the risk of, as practitioners in this area, whether it's regulators, governments, producers, transporters, are we running the risk here of becoming complacent and losing out on development opportunities, perhaps not recognizing that the public is not on the same wavelength? Now, Red, I know you're not going to be able to join us post 10:15, so can I throw it over to you to comment, and then any other panel members that might want to comment on that?
No, I think I'd very much like to associate myself with Mike's comment. We consistently do a great deal of opinion research about where the public is and everything, and it is, it is astonishing how little they know. It is almost so astonishing that you have to ask yourself, where do you begin? And over a number of years, we've been talking to people at DOE, working with the American Gas Association. Roger, you all feel exactly the same way, trying to see if they wouldn't appropriately take the lead and spend some time working on energy education, because it is so human. And it's hard to know where you get started. So I think that has been one of, and our solution has been, we deal with it as each issue comes up. We try and communicate on that issue or that aspect of it, but still not touching on the broader story. And if people don't understand, members of Congress don't spend the time They have a million issues to follow. And if they're not getting the push from the public, it's very, very hard when we go in to try and talk to some people and take some relatively common sense perspectives and ask for their support. So I see that as continuing to be a huge challenge, and I don't know how we get at it if the government isn't interested in taking some lead and helping shed some light on energy education.
Thanks, Red. I'd like to ask other panel members to comment, but before that, welcome James. Where we are, just so you can prepare yourself, is all the panelists have given their presentations, and I just asked a general question of the panelists, and so we'll just finish those comments, and then we'll turn it over to you for your comments to us.
Okay.
Anybody else like to comment on that general proposition, Mike?
Sure, Gerry, a couple of things. I mean, I guess I would probably need you to say, are we get complacent? I think from my presentation you might have gathered I think the answer is yes. I think we're not getting out there the way we should be. And exactly where do you begin? I was talking to a colleague the other day, and we were talking about, well, gee, government is incredible and industry is incredible, and you kind of throw up your hands and say, well, all right, we'll just give up. No, I mean, we have a problem. It's a big, big job, but you've got to start somewhere. And there are some places you can start, and again, emphasize things like using the North American Energy Working Group report as a good platform to build some understanding on, do some outreach, get out there. But the other one is clear statements of policy. And again, not to belabor it, but last year in the speech from the throne from the Government of Canada, it had a fairly extensive statement on the environment, most of which was really about energy. Had some things that were fair statements in it, but if you read it, looking at it on its face, it said two things about energy. It said energy is an environmental problem, and there are two solutions, renewables and conservation. I asked a member of Parliament about that. I said I was a bit concerned about the balance, and the response was, well, we know all that other stuff. Maybe we do, but we're not saying it. And I don't think the public knows it, and on the evidence, the public is not getting it.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, Gerry, just to comment from our perspective and looking at it, I agree with it. I mean, what we've been calling it is the invisible benefits. The natural gas is clean burning, it's efficient, it's all of those things, and it's come into the market and it's worked very well. For the typical public, we found it's just, it heats my house, it provides power for my air conditioner. What more do I need to know from that perspective? Until, as Neil well knows, and probably Pat as well, you start drilling in my backyard, you get a sour gas well near a city, you get an LNG facility coming in somewhere else, and all of a sudden these invisible benefits get minimized, and the high cost of it having next door to me starts to get amplified. I think they do balance each other off, but we're coming to this point of why should it happen near me or why should it happen around me when I don't see the direct benefits? And creating that linkage of the invisible benefit back to either the local community or those types of individuals is going to be, I think, a real challenge that we have as a gas industry to try and push this further as we go forward.
James, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll come that far, I'll lean up. And I usually usually I'm told I speak too loud, so let me know if you're not picking that up. Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for their understanding when I called them at 4 o'clock on Friday and told them that there was that the secretary asked me to be at a meeting this morning at 8:30, and they were quite understanding. I appreciate that. But let me, if I can, I'll make a couple key points, and I think, and then we can probably, I think having participated in past forums, one of the more interesting aspects of these get-togethers is the dialogue and interaction. So there are a few notes that I have as I look through them. I know everyone in this room is very familiar, but let me just pick up. I'll start with picking up on the education part that you were talking about when you came in, and I actually had it here as a pointer. Even though this is a natural gas forum, had a very kind email from the Canadian Embassy, I think it was on Friday, pointing out that EIA had acknowledged that Canada is now the largest foreign supplier of crude oil in the United States. And one of the things I'm constantly talking to my staff about, because we don't put it in our documents, I'm going to digress for oil for a second, is that the United States is the third largest oil producing country in the world. Now, if you ask an average American that, what's the thing? One, they wouldn't pick Canada or the U.S. So I think, you know, reminding people of those points, and that's a very positive story, and I think it's important. And we see the same trend, as we know, in natural gas, or a trend in natural gas, where our demand is increasing, and our easy to get to sources of supplies are declining. So we see demand is projected to grow at an annual rate of 1.5% from 2003 to 2025. And again, we all know that's driven by increased use in the power generation sector to a large extent. So we're facing an increasing gap between our production and our consumption. But I thought it would be important. One of the issue that we do at DOE is probably one of our very few natural gas regulatory functions is the licensing, import, and export of natural gas. And of course, that we see a growth in, have seen a strong growth in Canadian imports over the years, and that in 2003, Canada represented 16% of our supply. But one of the things that's in those numbers that I think is very interesting is not just that we tend to look at those aggregate net numbers, which are very important, but in 1993, 1993, let me take a step back first. In addition to gas coming into the U.S., of course, there's gas going from the U.S. to Canada. Now, there's a very large net gain in terms of U.S. supply. But in 1993, the amount of gas that was sent from the U.S. back across to Canada was 44.5 BCF. And in 2003, 10 years later, it was 294 BCF. And one of the interesting shows that tremendous integration that's happened over 10 years in our pipeline systems. And I know most of you around, I participate in some interesting conversations in that mid-90s time frame, particularly involving some of the western states, that they were very concerned about this growing Canadian gas supply coming in and taking over their market share. And the way I think I would characterize that, and I think it's a very important thing to look at in terms of this issue of security, is that we've moved in the 1990s, just 10 years ago, we were very dependent. I think dependent is the right word on one another, and we've seen how those pipelines grows to a very interdependent, very continental market. So, and that has enhanced our security and our markets in that way, because obviously we're moving that gas back over to Canada in areas where the pipeline system is most efficient to do that. So we're actually reducing the cost to consumers. Well, obviously, the challenge going forward and is to and I think it falls into education, is for all of us to make sure that people know that there isn't just one solution to the natural gas supply. LNG gets a lot of press, and so or Alaska gets press individually, but looking at the supply in a broader context, we know that the NPC report that came out in 2003. We focused on Alaska and LNG as the two parts of new supply, but the report clearly said that in 2025, 75% of our supply was still going to come from traditional onshore production in the Gulf of Mexico. However, a larger share is going to have to come from unconventional resources. And now I think our U.S., in fact, there's a question whether we should keep calling natural gas from coal seams unconventional, because it's become pretty conventional. It's 9% of our supply. And one of the things that we don't, that fits into that category on the Canadian side, there's significant coal bed methane resources in Alberta, perhaps as much as 190 TCF, according to CAP. So there are some significant supply sources existing. LNG, we're making progress, and I think that's exciting. And it's exciting for both the U.S. and Canada. I think it was last week, the first shipment came in from an offshore terminal on the on-ship regas system that's been developed. And later this week, Cheniere Energy will be breaking ground at Port Arthur facility. So for all there's still a lot of work to do on moving LNG forward, but it's exciting that this real progress is being made. And clearly, it's with an integrated continental market. Whether those the terminals in Canada or in the U.S. or in Mexico, we all benefit from those terminals in North America. I think one of our challenges coming up and continuing is bringing that natural gas from Alaska. 35 TCF of proven reserves already there, existing within the oil fields on the North Slope, already discovered, let alone the possible 100 plus TCF that could be, and estimates of well beyond that with methane hydrates when they become commercially productive. It's just getting the Alaska pipeline sited and built is a critical infrastructure for our future. And I think that is an area that clearly is going to require some coordination between the U.S. and Canada on that effort. And I think one of the things to acknowledge is a very, very complicated project. And so there's any number of ways that could be slowed down in the process. So I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us that the governments and industry work together to make sure that action or inaction doesn't make the project more complicated or otherwise slow it down. I think is just absolutely critical that moves forward. And clearly the most cost-effective and fastest path to constructing that pipeline is in the best interest of consumers in both of our countries. The U.S. and Canada energy legislation will be critical to meet our North American demand. Canada and the U.S. will continue to have the world's largest trading relationship and will continue to set the standard. And energy will continue to be the cornerstone of that relationship. The North American market will become even more integrated over time, and that mutual interdependence on natural gas markets will continue to build. The relationship will continue to be vital to the economy of both our nations.
Thank you very much, James. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have, we're going to take a short break, but I think we have the stage set for probably a lot of questions, some people take a lot of notes, so looking forward to that discussion session where, as James said, I think a lot of the value of these types of forums takes place. So before we go into break, I'd like to thank our panel for their insightful and thought-provoking comments. And as I mentioned, due to time constraints, unfortunately, Red Cavaney will be departing, I think, at this time, at the break. So thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. Betty Anthony has agreed to sit in Red's seat and provide the API perspective on these issues. So we appreciate that very much, Betty. This concludes the webcast portion of this morning's forum. Thank you to all of you who joined us this morning via the internet. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a short, about 15-minute break and reconvene with our discussion period. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Jim. Good seeing you. How have you been?
Wonderful, wonderful. Going to that fair, think of why.
Oh, are you? Great. Well, you gotta go.
Thank you. You heard that really nice, yeah. I should have wood. You see that one? Yeah, is that a table?
Oh, great.
Good success.
Awesome. Very interesting. Yeah, let's pile on.